Welcome to The Debate.
It's good to be here.
Today we are looking at a document that, well, it really shouldn't exist, at least not in the form that it does. We're analyzing a theological treatise. It's titled Justice, Judgment, and the Final Reconciliation of All Things. But this wasn't written by a tenured professor at Oxford or, a seminary doctoral candidate sitting in some comfortable study.
No, the byline is jarring. The author is identified only as prisoner 79283.
And that context isn't just trivia, it is the engine of the entire argument. This author is writing from inside the Nebraska correctional system. He's using the visceral, lived reality of incarceration, of being a number, a category of human, to dismantle one of the most heavyweight doctrines in Christian history, the doctrine of eternal conscious torment.
It's a very ambitious project for a prison cell. He's essentially taking the mechanics of the state penitentiary, the logic of sentences, verdicts, and parole, and using them to critique the mechanics of hell.
Precisely. And he argues that we've fundamentally misunderstood the nature of justice itself. The central tension of this text, and the question we're debating today, is a definition. It asks, is justice the declaration of a verdict, or is it the completion of a sentence?
And that distinction is the hinge the whole thing swings on. So, to set the stage, you are going to represent the prisoner's thesis, the view of universal reconciliation. You'll be arguing that criminal is a temporary alignment that must be destroyed so the person can be saved.
That is my position. I'll argue that a justice system, divine or human, that preserves evil forever in a containment facility has failed.
And I will take the traditional view, or what the text calls the structural view. I'm going to argue that while the prisoner's analogy is emotionally resonant, it fails metaphysically. I want to challenge this idea that you can neatly separate a person from their choices. If I choose rebellion against an infinite God, I am arguing that the sentence might justifiably be an infinite separation.
Then let's go to the beginning. The author starts by stripping away his identity. He writes, "My name was 79283. He describes that moment the prison gates closed. In the eyes of the state, he ceased to be a neighbor, a son, an employee. He became a category, criminal.
It's a dehumanizing shift, but he uses it to make a philosophical point. He distinguishes between the person, the ontological human being, and the category, the legal status.
Right. He says, quote, criminality is not a substance. It is a condition relative to law. When he walked into that cell, he wasn't metaphysically transformed into a different species. He was a human being in a state of misalignment with the law. And this is where he launches his attack on the traditional view of hell.
Go on.
He argues that traditional theology has confused a legal status with an eternal essence. We assume that because someone dies in a state of sin, they become sin. They become a sinner eternally. But he argues that just as a prisoner is a person under a sentence, a soul in judgment is a person under a process. And that leads to his core assertion. A sentence must be fulfilled to be justice. If a sentence is eternal and never completes, justice is never served. It is perpetually pending.
I understand the logic, but I have to push back immediately on the application. He calls the traditional view ruin maintained. He says if you lock someone up forever, you haven't solved the crime, you've just built a container for it. But isn't that exactly what the penal system is for? If a criminal is dangerous, justice is the safety of the community. The containment is the justice.
In a human court, perhaps, because we lack the power to cure the criminal. We contain because we cannot heal. But are we applying that limitation to God? The author writes, God judges to end evil, not to eternally preserve it. If hell is a place where rebellion, hatred, and pain exist forever, even if they are contained in a basement, then evil has achieved immortality. It has become a permanent feature of God's universe.
But the traditionalist would argue that the evil doesn't continue in the active sense of threatening God's kingdom. It continues as a monument to consequences. The prisoner seems to be importing a restorative justice model where the goal is rehabilitation into a universe that Scripture often depicts as retributive.
He anticipates that, and he asks, does a retributive sentence have to be infinite?
Well, that depends on who you sin against. This is the classic argument from Anselm. If I slap a neighbor, it's a misdemeanor. If I slap the king, it's treason. If I rebel against an infinite authority, do I not incur an infinite debt?
The text tackles this head-on, and this brings us to point 1 of our debate, the definition of justice. The prisoner uses what he calls prison logic to deconstruct the idea of the infinite debt.
Walk us through the Nebraska State Penitentiary analogy.
He points to the physical prison he is sitting in. The Nebraska State Penitentiary is an eternal structure. By that, he means it exists across time, it was there before he arrived, it will be there after he leaves. It is a permanent institution of judgment.
Okay, so the structure is permanent.
But the residency is temporary. He argues that the Bible's language of eternal fire or eternal judgment refers to the structure, not the duration of the sentence for the individual. The fire burns forever because God's holiness is forever. But the purpose of the fire is to burn away the criminal alignment so the person can be released.
That's a convenient reading, but does it hold up to scrutiny? He's splitting the eternal fire from the eternal torment. But look at the life sentence scenario. He brings this up, but I'm not sure he resolves it. In human law, if the judge gives a life sentence without parole, the completion of that sentence is death in custody. It never ends while the subject is alive. If God declares a sentence is eternal, isn't the completion simply the fact that it never stops?
No, because that creates a logical paradox. The author writes, is justice the declaration of a sentence or the completion of it? If the judge says you will be punished forever, the declaration is final. But the justice, the balancing of the scales, is never achieved. It becomes an asymptote. You are always paying the debt, but the debt is never paid. He calls that incoherence.
Incoherence?
Yes, he says a debt that cannot be paid is not a debt. It's a condition of slavery. If the purpose of judgment is to set things right, and eternal punishment keeps them wrong forever, it freezes the universe in a state of unresolved conflict. He says, quote, God does not manage a deficit forever. He clears the books.
It's a compelling economic argument that God demands a balanced ledger. But this moves us away from the courtroom and into the physics of the spiritual world. And this is where the text gets really dense. He calls this next point the load-bearing beam of his entire theology. Point 2, the ontology of evil.
This is where we have to ask the audience to put on their philosophy hats for a moment. This is crucial. The author states plainly, evil is privation, not substance.
He's drawing on a very old, very orthodox tradition here, Augustine, Aquinas. The idea is that evil isn't a thing in itself. It's like rot in a tree or rust on a car. You can have a car without rust, but you can't have a pile of rust that is shaped like a car without the metal. Evil is a parasite.
Exactly, and he uses the metaphor of darkness. You cannot bottle darkness. You can't hand someone a bucket of pure darkness. Darkness is simply the absence of light. Now apply that to God. If God is infinite existence, infinite truth, and infinite light, then evil, which is non-being, cannot eternally exist in his unveiled presence.
So his argument is, if God becomes all in all, as the Bible says, there is no room left for the nothingness that is evil.
Precisely. He writes, when the sun rises, the shadow doesn't fight back. It disappears. He argues that eternal conscious torment requires us to believe that God, who is being itself, will eternally sustain a pocket of non-being, of evil, in existence. He argues God cannot do that without contradicting his own nature.
That sounds beautiful, but I have to play the skeptic here. This view of evil as mere lack feels like it underestimates the active, violent will of a rebel. It sounds passive, but we know evil can be aggressive, and this leads to the biggest objection the text faces, which is the free will defense.
The idea that the door of hell is locked from the inside?
Right. C.S. Lewis's famous argument, God doesn't send people to hell, people choose it. They prefer their own autonomy over submission to God. My question, and the dissenter's question in the text, is this: can't a creature freely choose to rebel forever? Can't I look at the light and say no for eternity out of pure spite?
The prisoner's answer to that is fascinating, and it's controversial. He says no. He argues that that view redefines freedom into something impossible. He writes, if you think free will is the power to choose falsehood as ultimate truth forever, you have made the will greater than reality itself.
Explain the 2 + 2 = 5 analogy he uses.
He says you can choose to believe 2 + 2 = 5. You can write it on your cell wall. You can scream it at the guards. That is your freedom. But can you sustain that delusion forever in the presence of total truth, when you are forced to count your own fingers? No. He argues that eventually the reality of 2 + 2 = 4 breaks through. He says, in the presence of total truth, the will cannot eternally choose a lie. It's not that God forces you to bow, it's that the option of rebellion evaporates because it was based on an illusion. Resistance requires ignorance. Remove the ignorance and you remove the resistance.
I see the intellectual appeal. It suggests that all sin is essentially a form of stupidity or blindness. But does that strip the human will of its dignity? The dignity to be truly, fatally wrong? If I cannot hold out forever, am I truly free?
The author would ask, is a man who is addicted to heroin free to keep injecting it, or is his freedom actually a slavery to a chemical? True freedom is the ability to choose the good. He argues that God is the great liberator, not a cosmic hypnotist. He liberates the will from the addiction of sin so that it can choose the good.
It's a very high view of God's persuasiveness. But we are debating a text that claims to be biblical theology, not just philosophy. And the dissenter in me is getting impatient with all this Platonism. We have to look at the knockout verses. Point 3, the scriptural evidence.
The elephants in the room, Matthew 25:46.
Is aionios in both places. The argument from the traditional side is simple parallelism. If the life is eternal, meaning unending, then the punishment must be eternal, meaning unending. You can't change the definition of the adjective halfway through the sentence.
The author anticipates this. He doesn't deny the word aionios, but he offers what he calls the prison logic interpretation. He argues that the parallelism is about ultimacy, not duration.
That sounds like word games. Unpack that for me.
He says eternal life is participation in the divine reality, the age to come. That reality happens to be unending. Eternal punishment is the punishment of the age to come. It is a verdict that comes from the eternal court. It is irreversible. It is final. But, and here is the nuance, he argues, the verdict stands eternally. The consequence is permanent, but that does not mean the process of punishing is endless.
Give me a concrete example.
Capital punishment. If a man is executed, the punishment is eternal. He's dead forever. The judgment is final, but the act of execution, the electric chair, only takes a few minutes. The process is finite. The result is infinite.
So he's saying the destruction of the criminal record is an eternal act. It's done forever. But the sensation of pain doesn't last forever?
Exactly. He writes, justice is a completed act with an abiding result. The fire burns away the false self, the criminal identity. That identity is gone forever. Eternal punishment. But the person emerges on the other side.
That works for Matthew 25, perhaps. But what about Revelation 14? This is the text that usually stops the universalist argument dead in its tracks. The smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest, day or night. That doesn't sound like a completed act. That sounds like an ongoing, conscious nightmare. No rest.
It does, and the author acknowledges the severity of it. He calls it apocalyptic intensification, but he counters with what he calls the internal pressure of Scripture. He points to the very end of the book, Revelation 21:4.
He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain.
The advocate stands on this firmly. If eternal conscious torment is true, then Revelation 21:4 is a lie.
That is a bold charge.
Think about it. If there is a lake of fire full of billions of people, men, women, children, screaming in agony forever, then no more crying or pain is factually false. Pain is being preserved, it's just been moved to the basement. The author says traditional theology tries to solve this by saying, well, the no more pain only applies to the city, to the saved.
Which is a valid reading, isn't it? The text says outside are the dogs. The no more pain is a promise for the covenant people. The outer darkness is the quarantine zone for those who refuse the covenant. The joy of the city isn't dampened by the existence of the prison.
But the prisoner rejects the quarantine model of victory. He cites 1 Corinthians 15:28 that God will be all in all, not all in some. If God is all, there is no elsewhere for evil to hide. There is no outer darkness left when the light fills all things. He argues that if you have a quarantine, evil has not been destroyed, it has just been relocated.
He frames it as eradication versus containment.
Yes, he says God judges to end evil, not to manage it. He points out that the Bible uses eradication language, destroy the works of the devil, put away sin, death shall be no more. He says you can't have death shall be no more if the second death is an eternal state of dying.
This brings us to point 4, which is, I think, the most delicate part of his argument. It's the metaphysical surgery. The distinction between the person and the alignment.
He returns to his personal testimony here. 79:2383 is no longer a criminal. The person remains. He argues that when he finishes his sentence, the state destroys the criminal status, but the man walks free.
And he applies this to the lake of fire. He suggests the fire burns away the sinner so the man can be saved. But I have to ask, is this conceptually possible? We aren't just onions where you can peel off the sin layer and find a pure human underneath.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, look at human psychology. Sin corrupts the will, the desires, the heart. It weaves itself into our personality. If I am arrogant, that arrogance is part of me. If you burn away everything that is misaligned in me, is there anything left? Or have you just lobotomized me and created a robot?
The author argues that this is the very definition of the gospel. He quotes the concept of the old man and the new man. We are told to crucify the flesh, to die to self. He argues that judgment is just the final, absolute realization of that process. He says, the fire of judgment burns away the enmity so the image bearer can be reconciled. He believes there is a core image of God in every person that is deeper than their sin.
It's an incredibly optimistic anthropology. It assumes that at the bottom of every Hitler, every abuser, every rebel, there is a spark of God that wants to be found if only the layers of criminality were burned off. The traditional view is much more cynical, or perhaps realistic, about the human capacity to become identical with our sin, to become the enmity.
But he comes back to the privation argument. You cannot become enmity, because enmity is a nothingness. You cannot become darkness. You can only be lost in it. When the light comes, the darkness doesn't fight back. It vanishes. He writes, what remains is not enmity. What remains is the person reconciled to truth.
It forces a rereading of the wrath of God. In this view, God's wrath is not his hatred of the sinner, but his relentless love attacking the cancer that is killing the sinner.
Exactly. He calls the lake of fire a severe mercy.
We are coming to the end of our analysis, and I have to say, while I still have reservations about the scriptural hurdles, specifically the parallel language in Matthew, the author's vision of justice as completion is haunting.
It changes the stakes. If he is right, God wins means something very different than we thought.
If the traditional view is true, God wins by conquering his enemies and suppressing them. He wins by superior force.
But if prisoner 79283 is true, God wins by converting his enemies. He wins by superior love. The author argues that a victory where billions suffer forever is not a victory worthy of an infinite God.
However, I must offer the caution. If the prison is just an intense rehabilitation center, does it lose its deterrent power? Does it minimize the sheer horror of saying no to God? If I know the door eventually opens, do I take the lock seriously?
The author addresses that in his conclusion. He says the fire is real, the judgment is real. He describes it as severe and total. He's not saying everyone gets a free pass. He's saying everyone passes through the fire. But the purpose of the fire is to purify, not to torture. He asks, Do you want a God who manages evil or a God who eradicates it?
It's a vision that leaves us with a profound choice in how we view the end of the story. Is the lake of fire a torture chamber? Or is it a kiln? Is it where humanity is discarded or where humanity is refined?
In his final reflection, he writes, "When I walked out of that prison, I was no longer a criminal. The alignment was destroyed. The person remained. That is what God does with sin. Justice must be completed to be justice. And when God's justice is complete, there will be no more death, no more pain, no more enmity, only reconciliation, only love, only God all in all."
Whether you agree with his exegesis or not, Prisoners 792-83 forces us to ask what we really mean when we say justice, and he suggests that perhaps the victory is bigger than we dared to imagine.
Or perhaps more demanding than we realized.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining the debate.
Okay, let's unpack this. Usually when we sit down to do a deep dive, we're surrounded by a very specific kind of clutter.
Right.
I'm talking about a stack of hardcover nonfiction books, maybe a dozen peer-reviewed articles from, Nature or The Atlantic, or perhaps some investigative journalism pieces that have been making the rounds. We usually have a very polished starting point today.
Today is different.
Today is very different.
It is remarkably different. I don't think we've ever started a deep dive with a source quite like this one.
I am looking at a file on my screen. It's a PDF. The file name is, and I quote, 2013 Nebraska Prisoner 79283-teaching.pdf.
Hey. Yeah.
It doesn't exactly scream bestseller or groundbreaking research. It looks like a scanned court document or maybe a bureaucratic error that wound up on a server somewhere. It's got that mundane, dusty, institutional feeling to it.
It really does. It looks like the kind of paperwork you'd find misfiled in a damp basement in, like, Lincoln, Nebraska, sandwiched between a budget report and a maintenance request. But that is the deception of the medium. Because once you scroll past the metadata and the dry formatting, you realize you aren't looking at a legal appeal. You aren't looking at a complaint about the cafeteria food or a request for parole.
No.
You are looking at a remarkably dense, logically rigorous, and surprisingly profound philosophical treatise on the nature of eternity.
It's wild. I mean, it is a document written by a man who identifies himself in the text only as Prisoner 79283.
That's it. No name.
That was his number. That was his identity in the eyes of the state of Nebraska. But the text itself is this comprehensive argument that the number and the label criminal was never who he actually was.
And that is the hook right there. He opens with this line that just grabs you by the throat. He writes, "What I learned in prison, God taught me about hell."
That is such a heavy opener. I mean, it just immediately sets the stakes. So here's the mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack Prisoner 79283's argument. And I want to set the ground rules early because this gets into some heavy theological and philosophical territory. We aren't here to preach a sermon. We aren't here to tell you, the listener, what to believe about the afterlife or religion.
Right. We need to be very, very clear about that.
Yeah.
Our job is to objectively analyze the logic and the argumentation presented in this specific text. This prisoner is arguing against the traditional view of hell, what theologians often call eternal conscious torment. And he's arguing for a concept called universal reconciliation.
But, and this is the key part, he doesn't do it by just quoting happy verses and wishing for the best.
No, not at all.
He doesn't do it by saying, wouldn't it be nice if everyone just gigged along? He does it using what he calls prison logic.
Which is what makes this source so unique. He's viewing cosmic justice through the bars of a cell. And he argues that the way we traditionally think about hell is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how justice actually operates.
He claims criminality is a temporary status, not a permanent essence.
Right. And this is the big swing, the one that really challenges the status quo.
Yeah.
He posits that evil is metaphysically incapable of existing forever.
It's a bold claim. Evil cannot exist forever. I mean, that sounds nice, but he actually tries to prove it like a mathematical equation. It's fascinating.
It is.
So let's get into the mind of prisoner 79283. Where do we even start with something this dense?
We have to start where the text starts, with the framework of the prison itself. Specifically, the distinction he draws between identity and status.
Okay. So in the introduction of the document, the author describes his intake process at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. If you've never been through that or seen it in documentaries, it's a dehumanizing process. He talks about being stripped, searched, processed, fingerprinted, and then he's given this number, 79283. He says, in that moment, he ceased to be a name and became a category. He became a criminal.
Correct. And this is the foundation of his entire ontological argument. Ontology is just a fancy word for the study of being what things are. He draws a sharp triangular distinction between three things: the person, the category, and the number.
Break this down for us, okay?
The person is the human being, the conscious observer, the entity created, as he puts it, in the imago Dei, the image of God. That's the core reality. That's the thing that's real.
The fundamental self.
The fundamental self.
Yeah.
Then you have the category, which is the legal, status-convicted, guilty felon. It's a label. And finally, the number is just the institutional tag used to track the category. It's a pointer to the label.
It's just a filing system.
It's just a filing system.
I think this is where we usually get tripped up in society, right? If someone commits a murder, we don't just say that person committed a murder. We say that person is a murderer. We treat the action as if it rewrote their DNA. We treat the noun like it's their species.
Precisely. We engage in what philosophers call essentialism. We assume the crime reveals the essence of the person. We think the act defines the soul. But prisoner 79283 challenges this fundamentally. He writes, and I want to get this quote right because it's the pivot point for everything else, "Criminality is not a substance. It is a condition relative to law."
Not a substance, meaning it's not a physical thing. It's not like he grew a third arm or something.
Meaning it's not a fundamental building block of reality. He's arguing that when the prison gates slammed shut behind him, he didn't undergo some kind of biological or spiritual mutation.
Right.
He didn't acquire a new essence called criminalness that replaced his humanity. He entered a status. He says, I entered into a status of misalignment with the law.
Misalignment. That's a very mechanical word. It makes me think of a car shop.
That's a great analogy, actually. Let's play with that.
Yeah.
Imagine you have a high-performance car, a Ferrari. If that car's alignment is out, what happens?
It drives crooked. It pulls to the left. The tires wear out unevenly. It's dangerous to other cars on the road. It basically fails at being a good car.
Exactly. It violates the rules of the road. It is dangerous. But, and this is the key, has the car turned into a bicycle?
No, of course not.
Has it turned into a monster? Has it ceased to be a Ferrari?
No, it's still a Ferrari. It's just a Ferrari that steers badly.
It is a car in a state of error, a car in a state of misalignment. The author argues that the law punishes the alignment, not the essence of the man. The punishment is designed to address the condition, not to
destroy the object.
Not to destroy the object, exactly. It's corrective.
There's a quote here I highlighted. He writes, "At no point did the law say, you are now eternally and irreversibly a criminal in your essence. This is what you are, forever, unchangeably, metaphysically."
That's a huge distinction.
Yeah.
Because if the law did say that, I mean, if the law said you are now 100% criminal and you are 0% human, then there would be no point in a prison sentence.
Right. Think about it. If you are a criminal in your very atoms, no amount of time in a cell can fix that. You can't fix an essence. You can only fix a condition.
Exactly. The very fact that sentences have time limits implies that the condition is temporary. The law says you have a misalignment. The cost to correct that misalignment is X number of years. The implication is that once the sentence is served, the status is resolved.
The debt for that misalignment is paid.
The debt is paid. The alignment is hopefully corrected, but at the very least, the legal obligation is fulfilled.
So he's saying we confuse what I did with what I am.
Yeah.
And he thinks we do this with God, too, on a cosmic scale.
Yes. And here's the pivot to theology. This is where he takes prison logic and applies it to cosmic logic. He argues that traditional religion treats sin as if it were an eternal substance. We assume that when a human being sins, they fundamentally change into a sinner with a capital S.
A whole new creature.
A whole new creature. We act as if this new identity is so permanent, so sticky, that it defines them forever, even into eternity.
So we view sinner as a species. Like there are humans and there are sinners. And there are different breeds.
Exactly. But prisoner 79283 argues that just as a prisoner serves a sentence to correct a legal status, judgment in the afterlife is about correcting a moral status. It's about addressing the misalignment. It's not about locking away a person because they have mutated into a monster that can never be fixed.
So God sees the person underneath the status.
That's his argument, and God's judgment is directed at the status. to save the person.
Okay, that makes sense on a human level. I mean, we hope for rehabilitation, we want that. But I can hear the skeptics or just the traditionalists saying, sure, that works for burglary in Nebraska, but what about ultimate justice?
Right.
Doesn't God have to punish sin forever because he's infinitely holy? Doesn't the crime against an infinite God require an infinite punishment? That's the classic line.
That's the exact question the text pivots to next. This brings us to section 2 of the document, the logic of justice. And this is where he really leans into that prison logic to dismantle the idea of infinite punishment.
He poses a question that felt like a logic puzzle to me. It really stopped me in my tracks. He asks, is justice the declaration of a sentence, or is it the completion of it?
It's a brilliant framing.
Yeah.
Let's use his example to walk through this. The 10-year sentence. Imagine you commit a serious crime. The judge sentences you to 10 years. You go in. You serve every single day of those 10 years. You endure the isolation, the loss of freedom. Then the gate opens. You walk out. Has justice been served?
Yes, that's the definition. The debt is paid, the scales are balanced.
Right. The sentence was fulfilled. Justice is complete.
Now imagine a different scenario. The judge looks at you and says, I sentence you to eternal incarceration. You will never be released. The sentence will never be complete. Justice will never be fulfilled.
Okay. That's a nightmare. But in that scenario, can you ever say justice has been served?
That's the question. Intuitively, we want to say yes, because the bad guy is getting what he deserves. We see the suffering and we think that equals justice. But strictly logically, if you ask, is this transaction finished? The answer is no, because the sentence is never finished.
Exactly. Prisoner 79283 argues that if a sentence has no terminus, no endpoint, then the scales of justice never actually balance. The transaction is never closed. He calls this state perpetually pending.
Perpetually pending. That's terrifying. It's like a download bar stuck at 99% for a billion years. It never actually completes the file.
It is. And he argues that justice must be completed to be justice. If the punishment goes on forever, it's not justice. It is, in his words, ruin maintained.
Ruin maintain. That is such a heavy phrase.
Yeah.
It's passive. It's not an action. It's a state of being.
It's static. And this is the core of this section of his argument. He's saying that an eternal hell is actually a proof that God's justice failed.
Whoa. Slow down on that. That turns the whole religious argument upside down. Usually people say hell proves God is just. How does punishing bad guys prove justice failed?
Think about the goal of justice. Is the goal just to inflict pain? Or is the goal to set things right, to restore balance? If the problem, the sin, the rebellion, the misalignment is never solved, but just quarantined, then the problem persists forever.
It's still there.
It's still there. He argues that for God to be truly just, the sentence must eventually accomplish something. It must reach a resolution. If you have a prison that never empties, where the punishment never achieves a result, you don't have a justice system. You just have a warehouse for suffering.
It's a museum of failure. A monument to things God couldn't fix.
In a sense, yes. He contrasts a life sentence in our human system with eternal conscious torment. Even a life sentence in Nebraska ends. It ends at death. There is a terminus. But eternal conscious torment has no terminus. He says it is the eternal preservation of injustice.
Why injustice?
Because the misalignment is never corrected. The victim is never truly vindicated because the crime is effectively continuing forever in the state of the punished. The brokenness is preserved, not healed.
That's a really provocative way to look at it. Usually people defend hell because of justice. They say God is just, so he must punish sin forever. But this guy is saying God is just, so he must finish dealing with sin.
Correct. He's arguing that justice and endless punishment are actually mutually exclusive concepts. You can't have both. If it's endless, it's not justice, it's just maintenance. If it's justice, it must end.
Okay, my brain is starting to hurt. This leads us to the third section of the document, which I think is the hardest part to wrap your head around.
Yeah, this is where it gets abstract.
It's where he leaves the prison analogy for a minute and gets into pure philosophy. The metaphysics of evil.
Yes. This is the load-bearing beam of his entire thesis. If this point fails, the whole argument collapses. But if this point holds, he argues that eternal hell is ontologically impossible.
Okay. Ontology.
Yeah.
For those of us who haven't taken a philosophy class since freshman year or ever, remind us.
Ontology is the study of being. What is real? What exists? What is the nature of existence itself? The question he poses is, can evil eternally persist in the presence of infinite truth?
And to answer that, we have to define what evil is. And he uses this concept called privation.
This is a very old idea going way, way back to St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. The idea is that evil is not a thing in itself. It's not a substance. You can't go to the store and buy a bag of pure evil.
Right, like you can buy a bag of apples. Apples are a substance. They exist on their own. You can put them on a table.
Exactly. But evil is a lack. It's a distortion. It's a parasite. The classic analogy which he uses in the text is darkness. Darkness is not a substance. You can't have a bucket of darkness. You can't pour darkness onto a table. Darkness is simply what happens when light is absent.
Okay, so if I have a dark room and I turn on a flashlight, the darkness doesn't fight the light. It doesn't run into the corner and hide. It just ceases to be.
Because it never really was anything to begin with. It was just an absence. Now, apply this to God and evil. The author's premise is that God is infinite presence, infinite truth, infinite light.
Okay, so God is the sun in this analogy, a sun that fills the entire universe.
Right. And evil is privation. It's the absence of truth. It's the distortion of reality. So here is his equation, his metaphysical axiom. Evil as privation plus God as infinite presence. Evil cannot eternally persist.
Because there's nowhere for it to hide. There's no shadow left to cast.
Exactly. If God is all in all, which is a biblical phrase he quotes often, then God fills everything. If God fills everything with infinite light, then darkness must vanish. Not because God beat it up in a wrestling match, but because darkness is ontologically incapable of existing in the presence of total light.
So if you say that there is a hell where evil exists forever, you're basically saying there's a corner of the universe where God isn't.
Or you're claiming that evil is actually a substance, that it's strong enough to push back God's presence forever, that it's a thing that can coexist with the infinite. The author argues that gives evil way too much credit.
It makes evil into a rival god.
It does. It elevates evil to a godlike status, something self-sustaining. He argues evil is just a shadow, and shadows disappear at noon.
That makes sense on paper. It's beautiful logic. But I know what a lot of listeners are thinking right now, because I thought it too. What about free will?
Ah, yes. The classic objection. This is the biggest hurdle for this theory.
Right, like, sure, maybe evil is weak. But humans are stubborn. We are incredibly stubborn creatures. What if someone just refuses? What if I look at God and say, no thanks, forever? Doesn't God respect my freedom enough to let me sit in the dark forever if I want to? Can I lock the door from the inside?
The document addresses this head-on. And frankly, it's a pretty scathing takedown of that modern version of free will. Prisoner 79283 argues that we have a misunderstood definition of freedom.
How so? What's wrong with our definition?
We tend to think of freedom as the ability to choose anything, regardless of truth or consequences. The freedom to choose A or not A. But he says that true freedom is the power to align with reality. It's the power to act according to your nature and the truth of the world.
Oh, okay.
He argues that choosing 2 + 2 = 5 isn't freedom. It's insanity. It's delusion.
So if I insist that the sky is green and I want to jump off a cliff because I think I can fly, that's not me being free. That's me being broken.
Exactly. Imagine a man who is parched, dying of thirst in a desert. Someone offers him a bottle of cool, clear water. If he slaps it away and chooses to drink sand instead, is he free?
No. He's delirious. He's not thinking straight. He's making a choice that goes against his own survival, against his own nature.
The author argues that the only reason we choose evil is because we are deceived, we're deluded. We think the sin will make us happy. We think the rebellion will give us power. We are operating on bad data. We are drinking sand because we think it's water.
Okay, so sin is just a mistake then, a really, really bad mistake.
A catastrophic mistake, born of illusion. But, he argues, in the face of total truth, when you die and you stand before God and all the lies are stripped away, you see reality exactly as it is. The will cannot eternally choose a lie, because a lie loses its ground to stand on.
I see. So to say someone can rebel forever is to say that a person can sustain an illusion even when the infinite truth is staring them in the face, unveiled.
He writes, and this is a paraphrase, to say a person can will that 2 + 2 = 5 forever is to say the will is greater than reality itself. He argues that when the light is fully on, you can't pretend it's dark anymore. You might resist for a moment, you might struggle, you might thrash against it, but eternally.
Yeah.
Impossible. The delusion collapses.
And once a delusion collapses, the rebellion collapses.
Right. Not because God forced you, but because you finally saw that the sand was sand and the water was water, and you're thirsty.
That connects back to the prison idea. The criminal identity is a delusion. It's a false alignment. Once the truth is revealed, that identity can't survive.
Precisely. The criminal dies so the man can live.
Okay, so we've got the prison logic identity versus status. We've got the philosophical logic evil as privation. But for a lot of people, specifically people from a Christian background, The biggest hurdle is the Bible itself.
Of course.
Because there are verses, famous verses that seem to say, hey, hell is forever, deal with it.
The gotcha verses.
And the source document doesn't shy away from these. I respect that. He doesn't just ignore the hard stuff. There's a whole section called Dismantling the Traditional View.
It's a rebuttal section.
Yeah.
He takes the 3 strongest arguments for eternal conscious torment and tries to take them apart using his framework.
Let's look at the first one, Matthew 25.46. This is the big one. It says, the wicked go to eternal punishment and the righteous go to eternal life.
Right. And the traditional argument is very simple, and on the surface, very strong. The word used for eternal is the Greek word aitinios. It's used in both halves of the sentence.
Right.
So the argument goes, if heaven is forever, hell must be forever. You can't have one be endless and the other be temporary if you use the same word. It's a parallelism argument.
It seems like a slam dunk logic. If the punishment ends, does the life end too? Is heaven temporary? That's the fear.
It does seem that way until you look at how the author deconstructs it. He argues that the parallelism proves equal finality, not identical mechanics.
Equal finality. That sounds technical. Unpack that for us.
Okay, eternal life is participation in the divine reality. It is a life that belongs to the age to come. It is ongoing. It's endless because God is endless. Eternal punishment, he argues, is punishment that belongs to the age to come. It is a punishment of the eternal order.
So it's from God. It's final.
It's from God. It's final. But, and here's the key, he argues that a punishment can be eternal in its effect without being an endless process of torment.
Can you give me an example, like a real-world one?
Let's go back to the prison analogy. If you are convicted of a felony, you have a permanent record. The conviction is an eternal fact about your life.
Yeah.
It never goes away. The verdict is final, irreversible. In that sense, it is an eternal judgment.
Okay, I follow. The record is permanent. I can't undo the fact that I was convicted. It's on my history forever.
But you don't stay in the cell forever. You serve the time. You leave. But the fact that you were judged remains forever. The author argues that eternal punishment means a punishment that comes from the eternal God, carries ultimate weight, and has irreversible consequences. Specifically, the destruction of the old self.
The destruction of the criminal identity.
Exactly. But it doesn't necessitate that the person is being actively tortured in a fire for trillions of years.
So the verdict is eternal. The act of punishing has a purpose and therefore an end.
Exactly. He says the verdict stands eternally, the consequence is permanent, but the process is not endless. The criminal you were is gone forever. That is an eternal death of the ego, but the person is restored.
Okay, that's compelling. What about the second one, Revelation 14? This is the scary one. It talks about smoke rising forever and no rest day or night.
Yes, the imagery here is intense. They will be tormented, and the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever.
It sounds pretty clear. Forever and ever. That doesn't sound like a weekend stay.
The author argues this is memorial language.
Memorial language, like for a monument.
Precisely. Think of a city that has been burned to the ground in a war. The city is gone. It's destroyed. But the smoke rises from the ruins as a signal, a monument. The smoke signals that the destruction is complete and irreversible. It doesn't mean the fire is still burning the same buildings a million years later. The buildings are gone. The smoke is the testimony.
So the smoke is a sign that the job is done, the battle is over, the city is conquered.
Yes, it stands as a monument to God's judgment against sin. And regarding the no rest day or night phrase, he argues this applies while the sentence is active. It describes the severity of the process, not the duration of eternity.
Like saying, I had the flu and I got no rest day or night. It doesn't mean I have the flu forever. It just means while I had it, it was relentless.
Exactly. But he adds another point here that I found really interesting. He points out a contradiction within the book of Revelation itself.
Oh, right. The no more tears thing. I had this highlighted.
Yes. Revelation 21, the very end of the Bible, says that in the end, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore.
It's a beautiful image. It's the ultimate promise of restoration.
But the author in our text points out, if there is a hell just outside the city walls where billions of people are screaming in agony forever, then no more pain is a lie.
Ooh.
If people are dying eternally in a lake of fire, then death is no more is false. Death still exists, it's just been relocated.
That's a massive logical problem. If God wipes away every tear, but half of humanity is weeping in hell. He didn't wipe away every tear, he just wiped away the tears of the winners.
Right. The author argues that for Revelation 21 to be true, for God to be all in all, and for pain to truly end hell, cannot be a permanent state of suffering for persons. It must be a process that ends. The math of no more tears doesn't work if hell is eternal.
That actually leads perfectly into the third rebuttal, 2 Thessalonians 1.9, eternal destruction.
The traditionalist says, see, destruction, ruin, forever.
And the author says,
He says, yes, destruction. But what is being destroyed?
the misalignment, the criminal status.
Exactly. He argues that eternal destruction is the ruin of the enmity. It is the annihilation of the criminal identity. Prisoner 79283 is destroyed forever. He never comes back. That number is retired. That identity is ash. But the man who wore the number, he is saved.
So the sinner is executed so that the son can live.
That's the core of his theology. The fire consumes the false self so the true self can emerge.
This moves us into the 5th section of our deep dive, the end state. What does the universe look like when God is finished? This is where the rubber meets the road.
The document contrasts two views here, containment versus eradication.
Containment is the traditional view.
Right. In the traditional view, evil is quarantined. God builds a wall around hell, throws the bad guys in, and locks the door. Evil still exists, sin still exists, hatred still exists. It's just contained in a corner of the universe.
It's like a cosmic nuclear waste dump. You don't get rid of the radiation, you just bury it and hope it doesn't leak.
Exactly. But the author argues for eradication. He cites verses like 1 John 3.8, the Son of God appeared to destroy the works of the devil, not to manage them, to destroy them.
And 1 Corinthians 15.28, God may be all in all.
Eradication means it's gone, zero, none left. He emphasizes that if hell exists eternally with sinners inside, then God's victory is partial. He didn't destroy evil, he just managed it. He just became the cosmic jailer of evil.
That's a haunting image. God is the eternal warden of a prison full of sin.
And the author argues that's not a victory, that's a stalemate, a dualism. Good here, evil there, forever. Universal reconciliation, in his view, is the only framework that allows for total victory. No more death, no more pain, no more enemy, the board is cleared.
God all in all. Not God in some people and sin in the others.
Precisely. If there's one spot in the universe where God is not, then he is not all in all. The equation doesn't balance.
It's a lot to process. It really forces you to ask what you think the goal of the universe is. Is it to separate the good from the bad? Or is it to make everything good?
That's the ultimate question. Is God a judge looking for a conviction or a doctor looking for a cure?
Let's bring it back down to earth. Or, back to Nebraska, I guess.
Right.
Section 6, the personal application. Because this isn't just theory for prisoner 79283, this was lived experience.
No, not at all. The whole document is framed by his release. He talks about the day he walked out of the Nebraska State Penitentiary.
He describes the gate opening, the sunlight hitting him. He says, when I left, the number 79283 ceased to define me.
The criminal alignment was destroyed. Why? Because the sentence was served. Justice was completion. The law was satisfied not because he was dead, but because the requirement was met.
He makes a point that the prison itself still exists. It's still there.
Yes, the Nebraska State Penitentiary is an eternal structure in the sense that it endures. It's still there, the walls are still concrete, but he's not there.
And he applies this to the Lake of Fire. This is a really interesting twist for me.
He believes the Lake of Fire is real. He believes it is severe. He doesn't think everyone just gets a free pass and skips into heaven. He describes the fire as purgative. It burns away the false self, the criminal identity, the sin.
It's like chemotherapy for the soul. It hurts, it's intense, but the goal is to kill the cancer, not the patient.
That's a perfect analogy. The traditional view says the patient is the cancer, so you burn them both forever. This view says the patient has cancer, so you burn the cancer to save the patient.
And the punchline of his story, he says, when the fire has done its work, what remains is the person reconciled to truth.
It's a hopeful ending. It transforms the concept of judgment from a horror story into a redemption story. A painful one, perhaps, but one with a purpose.
So to recap, we've been unpacking 2013 Nebraska Prisoner 79283-teaching.pdf, and we found 3 main pillars to this prison logic.
First, justice is completion, not infinite pending status. If the check is never cashed, the debt is never paid. A prison that never releases is a failure of justice.
Second, evil is a shadow. It's a privation. It cannot survive infinite light. You can't have a bucket of darkness in the middle of the sun. The 2 + 2 = 5 delusion cannot survive the presence of truth.
And third, the criminal is destroyed so the person can be saved. God is against the sin, specifically because he is for the sinner.
It's a compelling argument. I mean, whether you accept it theologically or not, you have to admit the prison logic holds together surprisingly well. It's consistent.
It's internally consistent, and it challenges us to check our own assumptions about what we want justice to look like. Do we want retribution, or do we want restoration?
That leads me to a final thought. The author suggests something really provocative at the end of the text. He suggests the reason we are so afraid of this idea, the reason we cling to the idea of an eternal hell, is because we confuse the destruction of our sin with the destruction of ourselves.
That's deep. We identify so closely with our criminal number, our flaws, our pride, our misalignments, that we think if God destroys that, he destroys us. We think, if I'm not my ego, who am I?
But the document asks us to imagine a justice system, both human and divine, where the goal isn't just punishment, but actual restoration, where the number is deleted, but the human walks free.
It asks us to imagine that justice and love aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same coin.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. It's been a heavy one, but hopefully it sparks some new thoughts about justice, identity, and maybe even eternity.
Always a pleasure to explore these depths with you.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next one. Keep diving.
So, what if our whole idea of justice isn't about eternal punishment, but about something else entirely? About completion. Today, we're diving into a really powerful argument that uses one person's story to completely reframe one of theology's oldest, toughest questions.
The text we're digging into today opens with this, just a stark, simple declaration. It's not just a number, right? It's a whole identity given by the law, and this one line becomes the central metaphor for a deep dive into justice, judgment, and what it really means for a sentence to be served. We're starting with one person's story, but as you're about to see, it's really an argument about the nature of reality itself. All right, so the first big idea we have to get our heads around is this really crucial distinction, the massive difference between a person and their legal status. Seriously, this idea is the foundation for everything else that's coming. So here's how the text breaks it down. On one side, you've got the person. That's the permanent human being, your core identity. And on the other side, you have the category. This is the temporary legal status, like criminal. The argument is that criminal just describes a condition, a relationship you have to the law at a certain point in time. It's not the substance of who you are forever. Let me put it another way. Criminality isn't something you are in your very essence. It's a state you're in, a condition. And because it's a condition, it can change. It's a temporary alignment that's designed to be resolved once justice has run its course. And that simple idea sets up the next critical question. And this leads to a pretty radical way of rethinking justice itself. The argument here is that real justice isn't just about handing out punishment. It's about completion. It has an endpoint. So the source asks this really fundamental question, and think about it for a second. When a judge declares a 10-year sentence, is justice served right then and there, or is it served 10 years later when the person actually walks out the door? The text argues the answer is obvious, but we often forget what it implies. So here's how a finite sentence is supposed to work. It's a clear, logical flow. A crime happens, a sentence is declared, that sentence is served, all of it, and only then, at that final step, is justice actually completed. The debt is paid, the process has a definitive end. Simple, right? But what happens if that sentence is eternal? Well, you get stuck. Step 3 never ever finishes, which means you can never ever get to step 4. Justice isn't actually fulfilled. It's just stuck on pause, forever pending. The scales of justice never really balance. So the crucial point is this. A system where the sentence is infinite isn't a system of completed justice. According to the author, it's just a system of, perpetual punishment maintenance. It's a process without an end, without a resolution, and because of that, it fails to be what it even claims to be.
Okay, and this is where the argument takes a really fascinating turn. It takes this same logic about justice and applies it to theology, creating this powerful analogy to separate the permanent reality of judgment from the ultimate fate of the person being judged. Let's break this down. The prison building itself, the Nebraska Penitentiary, that's an enduring structure, right? It's still there. But the occupant, prisoner 79283, he was released. Why? Because his status of criminality was completed. The theological claim runs on a parallel track. The structure of judgment, or hell, can be an eternal reality, but the person in sin can be reconciled once their status, their sin, is judged and destroyed. It's simple, really. The prison can be permanent without the prisoners having to be permanent. So the conclusion is this. And eternal judgment doesn't mean the person being judged has to be preserved in their state of sin forever. Instead, the judgment acts on the sin itself, with the whole point being to destroy it.
Now we're getting to what the source calls the load-bearing beam of this entire argument. We're moving beyond the legal analogies and into the fundamental nature of reality itself. This is the deep stuff.
This is the core question. It's not about how to translate one specific word in the Bible, it's about basic metaphysics. Can something that is fundamentally false or broken or an absence, can it survive forever when it's confronted by something that is infinitely true and whole?
And to answer that, the author brings in a classic philosophical concept, privation. The idea is that evil isn't a thing in itself. It's not some dark substance with its own independent existence. It's a lack, a corruption, an absence of the good. Kind of like a hole in a sweater. The hole is only defined by the sweater it's in.
Here's a great way to think about it. Darkness. You can't put darkness in a jar and carry it around, right? It has no substance. It's literally just the absence of light. So what happens when you flip on a light switch in a dark room? The darkness doesn't put up a fight. It just vanishes. It ceases to be because its very existence was defined by the absence of that light.
So the logic flows like this, and it's pretty straightforward. If evil is an absence, like darkness, and God is infinite presence, like light, then the conclusion is basically a matter of ontology. Darkness cannot exist in the full presence of infinite light. And so, evil cannot eternally persist in the unveiled presence of infinite good.
Okay, so how does this metaphysical argument connect to what the Bible actually says about the end of everything? What does a total victory over evil truly look like according to Scripture?
The source points to all this language throughout Scripture that suggests a total victory. You see these powerful verbs like destroy, put away, and these absolute phrases like no more or reconcile all things. The argument is that this language points to a complete eradication, not just containment. Evil isn't just moved to another location, it's destroyed.
This brings us to two very different ideas. The containment view suggests evil gets locked away forever, kind of quarantined from the rest of creation. But the eradication view, which is being argued for here, says evil is actually destroyed, completely removed from reality. The author contends that this is the only way for God's victory to be total, not just partial.
And we come full circle, right back to the prisoner. His experience becomes the final perfect illustration. When his sentence was done, the status of criminal was destroyed. That temporary alignment was gone, but the person, the human being, remained. In this view, divine judgment does the exact same thing. It destroys the sin, the enmity, the false alignment, and the person is what's left.
And so we end right where we began, with the central thesis. The idea that true justice, whether it's human or divine, has to have a goal, a purpose, and ultimately a completion. Because a process that never ends isn't justice fulfilled, it's just punishment maintained forever. And for the author of this text, a truly victorious God is one whose justice is so perfect, it doesn't just contain evil, it eradicates it completely, until God is, finally, all in all.